Hey guys, welcome to the Way Wednesdays. So glad to have you with us. Guess who I've got with me? You guessed it. I got Pastor Gary over here. Hey,
Pastor Doug over there.
good to see you, brother. Hope you're doing well.
Likewise, and
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah. Man, we had a great time over the feast, right? It's always kind of a bummer when they're over, and kind of a relief because there's a lot of work and there's a lot of activity that's going on. It's a lot of fun. Um, but it's to some degree it's just like, okay, we're done. But we still have to talk about the Shmini Atzeret, right? Because we talked about Simchat Torah, and we talked about the joy of Torah. We didn't talk about that eighth thing. So let's take a few moments to talk about that, and then I just want to let people know that we are going to get into to the Genesis portion. We'll be taking your questions. If you can, put the word question in front of your question. Helps you know that you're asking something instead of just saying something. And yeah, and come to Israel with us. Go to our website,
Oh,
thewaycongregation.com, and get all the information about that. So, Gary, what's up with Shmini Atzeret?
well, I think you make a good point earlier in saying, there's a lot going on, especially in this seventh month. We're just winding down the seventh month, uh, but it's almost impossible to touch, it is impossible to touch on every aspect of the feasts, the fall feasts. Even if you just relegate your discussions to the commandments and the observances and what the Torah plainly says, when you start looking at a lot of the spiritual meanings of these types of things and start integrating the fulfillment found in Yeshua, it goes way beyond anything that we can cover in just a few sessions. And I've been enjoying this time with you, Doug. We've been kind of talking about this ever since Tisha B'Av. 7 weeks leading up to the fall holy days, and throughout the month of Tishri, we've been focusing on this period of time which deals with the repentance, with redemption, with celebration, and with Sukkot, and the final day is the eighth day, which I think oftentimes just kind of falls off the map in terms of what happens with the other holy days, and it is so significant. And so I think it's worthwhile at least spending a little bit of time as we kick off the new book of the new Torah cycle again this year, because the eighth day really has to do with the renewal of all things, and the implications of that are enormous. So oftentimes people think that Sukkot is like the big holiday, but if we look at the scriptures and we say, we look at Leviticus 23. Of course, Leviticus 23, especially for people who are new to Torah, is your kind of go-to guide for everything feasts and festivals. I heard somebody recently describe it as kind of God's year planner. So, yeah, you can look, and you've got the plan for the entire year, and it's ready to go. But if you look at Leviticus 23, beginning in verse 34, it talks about the festival of booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. And you shall celebrate it for 7 days. Again, it reiterates that again in verse 36. It tells us again in verse 39, you shall celebrate this for 30 days, or for 7 days. Again in verse 40 and 41, it says, and you shall celebrate this festival for 7 days. We see it over in Numbers 29, where it talks about the sacrifices on that day. It says, and you shall celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. Um, Deuteronomy 16 is also a great place to kind of catch up on the feasts, where it talks about, again, celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. And again, it's one of the three primary pilgrimage feasts, right? Exodus 23, Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 16 again talk about these three pilgrimage feasts of Hag HaMatzot, right, the Feast of Unleavened Bread,
Hmm.
and Shavuot and Sukkot as these pilgrimage festivals. So oftentimes Shmini Atzeret gets forgotten, but it really is kind of the completion of things. We
Yeah.
read about this observance not only in the Torah, but also in the observance of Solomon's dedication of the temple in First Kings and Second Chronicles. We find references there, and even in the Second Temple period, we see it in the book of Nehemiah, where it says again, "You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths for 7 days." But then
Right.
we begin to take a look and we see that it's also mentioned. And on the eighth day they held a solemn assembly. And on the eighth we see that both in Kings and Chronicles and Nehemiah as well as in the Torah. So there is this reference to this eighth day festival. So what's the meaning of it all? And that's a really good question. And I think as we look at any of the fall feasts and festivals, we take a look at what is the meaning of these things. And Doug, you and I spoke about this a little bit earlier this week. And that's where you have the benefit of really understanding Hebrew to take a look at, we say, oh, it's eighth day festival, but it's not Yom Shmini. It's not the eighth day. It's referred to Shmini Atzeret, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
so really the question is, what's Atzeret?
Yeah.
And you want to go into that a little bit?
Well, it means to restrain, to stop, right? So it means to
Yeah.
stop. You
So
know.
so how do
Well,
so how do we
well,
get the eighth day, or it says you shall, if I look in my interlinear
mhm.
and I hover over the look, I see, I can identify Shmini, right? I identify Yom. I look, I highlight Yom, Yom. Okay, well that's not Atzeret. I, until I hover over solemn assembly, do I find the word Atzeret, right? So how do you get stop and solemn assembly together in
Yeah, it's an interesting question. How I can see, I can definitely see how it's derived, but I'm not entirely sure how it's necessary, right? You can certainly understand that they were commanded to congregate, right? There's absolutely no doubt about that. The question really becomes, how does this word go from one to the other? It means to stop, right? To stop. So I think there's something in that, right? You have in this idea of restraining, halting, stopping. Um, those are the meanings. Uh, so when you're all going about, it's really hard to come together, right? So
right?
when you stop, then you come together, right? So it's the assembly and the stopping are related, right? And so I think that the idea of the eighth day assembly is more of an inference from where God says that you should assemble, but the Shmini Atzeret itself is the eighth day of stopping. And what's beautiful about that is when we look at the 7,000 year plan that God has, that after the 7,000 years are completed, after the 1,000 years are completed, Satan's let out for a brief period, which I believe is 1 year. He does his thing, deceives the world again, and then he's destroyed. And then what? Right? Then what? Right? So that now we're starting a new day as far as this prophetic idea. We're starting a new 1,000 year cycle. That would be the eighth day. And it's beautiful, right? Because on the eighth day, right, we've all experienced this. If your week is, for many people, your week starts on a Monday and it goes through, Sunday, right? Um, so when you go back to work on Monday, right? That's your eighth day, right? We understand, of course, the eighth day. Well, it's actually Monday, but anyway, so it's the seventh day is the Shabbat. I'm all confusing myself. So actually, the next following Sunday, I'm so confused. The following Sunday is actually the eighth day, right? So it's going back to one, but it's also the eighth. And that's what's so beautiful. So when we think about just our Torah cycle, let's just think about it in that terms, right? We have gone through, right? We've gone through chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter. And then we stopped. We literally stopped because we came to the end of the Torah reading cycle. And now we're going back to the beginning, right? When you get to the end of Shabbat, you are stopping and then you're going back to the beginning. When we get to the end of the 7,000 years, we're stopping that plan, that program, and then we're now going to a new beginning. And I really think that is the idea, that there is kind of that full stop idea to where we are now going to something new. We're going to something of a different nature. That's pretty exciting.
Well, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. And we get this, of course, out of Scripture in a number of different places. Um, Specifically for this time of year, it confuses people, still confuses me. It's like, how can you have, Rosh Hashanah, right, the head of the month, at the first of the seventh month? And
Yeah.
when clearly God says, that the Nisan shall be the first of your months. And yet
Mm-hmm.
we go to Exodus chapter 23, and we read in verse 16, when it's talking about the Feast of the Ingathering, it says that the Feast of the Harvest, the first fruits of your labor, which you have sown in the field, and the Feast of Gathering at the end, the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year. So the reference there is to Sukkot, right, the Feast of Ingathering, but it
Mm-hmm.
plainly says at the end of the year. Well, it's only the seventh month, but it's exactly what you spoke
Yeah.
about and alluded to with kind of the seven millennia coming to the end and then a start. And it's no coincidence that the Torah reading cycle is structured so that it ends and begins at this time, because it is you've come to the stop, to the end, to the completion, to its fulfillment, to its totality, and then you're moving in. Think of the days of creation, right? So you have, we say the 7 days of creation, but really there's 6 days of creation, the Sabbath, and then you start. So you have this natural creation and then you enter into the supernatural, and that's the way I look at it from the sense of the millennia, right? And this world, this earth, this time that we're in now, as it draws to an end, as it comes to an end, as it comes to the stop, we're right on the precipice of the new beginning, which takes us from this realm, this natural realm, into a supernatural realm. We see
Mm-hmm.
that with famous eights in the Bible, right? 8 days of before a circumcision. You're taking something that's natural and you're applying the supernatural, the sign of the covenant, to it. It's a really interesting image to look at that. We look at the high priest wears 8 different vestments that set him apart. We look at the Torah, and specifically in Psalm 119, right, the longest psalm in the Bible, right? It extols the praises of the Torah in in a acrostic, right? But it's an acrostic of octets, right? There's 8 verses for Aleph, 8 verses for Bet, 8 verses for Gimel, and so on and so forth, creating Psalm 119, which take this Torah and describe it in its supernatural realm. There's so many hidden meanings that are found, I think, within the number 8.
Yeah.
And Shmini Atzeret is one of those
Yeah.
that make it so significant. And And again, so that's why I wanted to take just a little bit of time tonight to say, let's not lose sight of that, because it's the what next, the
Yeah,
what next.
yeah,
And when we talk about circumcision, right? Circumcision is such a central theme of the covenant that God has had with, from the beginning with Abraham, right? And yet we see from Jeremiah and Ezekiel and others, Deuteronomy, the Torah talks about, it's not the fleshly circumcision. Romans talks about it's not the circumcision of the flesh that matters, but it's this supernatural circumcision of your heart, where the Torah is now implanted within us. And it no longer is it an outward sign, but it is an inward transformation that takes place. But it all revolves around the number 8, the Shemini. And
yeah.
so we
Well, let me share a
prepare
comment.
to, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So this is from Shemin. She says it's not really a cycle in the sense that we don't go through exactly the same trajectory as before, but it's more like a spiral. So we resume the same on a new trajectory. I like that. I like
I
that. If we're
like that
coming
too.
around, we're also moving. We're moving ahead, right? We're moving in a
Well,
direction, in a
and
circular way.
it's like we were talking about as we jump into Genesis. It's like, oh, don't you guys ever get tired of reading the Torah year in, year out, year in, year out? And it's like it's a never-ending well. It's like if
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
relearning the same things year in and year out, we're not making any progress. We're not growing spiritually. We're not growing closer to the Lord. Our relationship isn't getting any deeper. It is. I like that. It's a spiral that takes us closer and closer to God's essence as we do that. And as we read from the scrolls this last week, you and I, um, we read the last word of the Bible, right? Or the last word of the Torah is Israel, ends with a lamed, right? The first word, Bereshit, begins with a bet. You put the lamed and the bet together, and what do you have? Love. It's your heart.
mm,
You seat this in your heart as your heart opens up to the Word, and we grow in it, and it begins this next phase of the spiral. And I think that's the message of Simchat Torah, is kind of this
yeah,
preparation for this new creation, this new transformation from the natural to the supernatural that will ultimately be fulfilled with Yeshua's return, when Satan is bound and the final judgment occurs, and we enter into this time of eternity.
oh, man, great stuff. You're still right. I mean, you keep studying the Bible, and you're like, I didn't see that before. that's that's why we keep studying. It does not get old. It's never outdated. Imagine if you were to read a medical textbook from 100 years ago. You'd probably learn some things, right? But you'd be like, this thing is really out of date, right? Because we have moved
Right.
on. Humanity has moved on, but we never move beyond the Bible, because there is always more to not just discover on an intellectual basis. There's lots to discover there. You'll never get to the end of it. But there's so much more to discover on a spiritual basis, on a relationship with God, a relationship with man kind of basis, and this is where, when we're studying it, we're not just trying to gain more brain cells. We're really trying, hopefully, we're trying to have a transformation in our hearts. And that's where sometimes it takes some time. It takes life lessons. Sometimes that school of hard knocks to knock that through our brains, that this isn't what you're supposed to be doing. And then you go back to the text after that certain lesson, and you're like, oh, that's what he meant, right? Now I get it, right? I had no idea what he was saying before, but now that I've gone through this really hard time because of my stupidity, now I understand what he's saying, and it makes perfect sense, and I can read it with completely fresh eyes, and it's not the same.
And I think another aspect of that too is, as Scripture opens up to you, and you find out new things, it's like you have to tell somebody. It's about
Mhm.
proclaiming the word. It's about sharing the gospel. It's about, do you know how great the Lord is? Do you know what He's done for us? Do you know how He has fashioned this world for us to live in? Do you know what He's asking us how to live and how to relate to Him? And it becomes this story that you can't help but tell somebody else.
Mm.
And so, as much as it is for self-reflection and to transform into a better person, that part of that better person is making others around you better people
Mhm.
as well, and then sharing in that love and rejoicing together in the glory that He has put before us in His Word. And it truly is. We say it's a living Word, and we should experience that in our lives. It should animate us. It should make us come to life. It should provoke us to action, and not just to study, right? It's like,
Right.
yeah, sometimes
Yeah,
we're good. Yeah,
I
yeah.
can get something there because I love to study. It's so fun. But I'm always reminded if I'm only doing this for brain cells, I'm in big trouble because I really have to have a transformation. If it's just for knowledge, then I'm just a Gnostic. But if it's knowledge to teach me about God and to lead me in His ways and to help me fall more in love with Him, then it has value. Then it has incredible value. And it's not even about the knowledge, it's about that deeper relationship so I can walk and do and not just be a hearer, but a doer of His word. All right. Well,
Amen.
we can talk on with this theme all night. Let's get into Genesis. Speaking of new beginnings, let's get back into that new beginning. Now, this portion is 6 chapters. We're probably not going to make it through all that, but I thought what we could do, Gary, is maybe at least get some of the highlights because there's obviously a lot of great stuff in here. And I thought it would be beneficial if we could maybe look at some of the so-called difficulties, which again, we're not going to get through it all because there's a lot. But let's at least get started in the text and let's take a gander here at what we got. So, um, first word in the beginning, right? In the Hebrew, Bereshit, at the first. Bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Man, we could talk a long time just about that. But I'd love to just point out the fact that in verse 2, he now gives a parenthetical statement. He's now telling us what the earth was. The earth was without form and void, right? So think of cement in a cement mixer, right? You're building a house and your neighbor comes over and says, "What you building? A house?" And he looks in your cement mixer. That doesn't look at the house to me. Well, it's not a house yet, right? I got to put the thing together, right? This is what the stage we're at in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. God is He just created the cement. He just created the stuff. Then He's going to put it together. So the earth at this point has no form and it's void. It's cement in the cement mixer. There's nothing there yet. And the Spirit of God is on the face of the deep, hovering. That word hovering, meruchefet, I believe, really is this idea of infusing it with energy. It's the idea of a mother eagle hovering, brooding over her nest, that kind of shaking, quivering type of movement. So God is energizing His creation, and then He says, "Yehior," right? Let there be light, and there was. I mean, Gary, that right there is mind blowing, right? Because God didn't have to go and get a bunch of elements together and mix them together and try to, make fire or something like that. He just said, "Let there be light," right? And there was light, right? He spoke. He spoke, and things just happened. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
wow, that is so cool. We see in Psalm 148 that He spoke all these things, and He spoke the angels into existence. I imagine God saying, Yehi Michael, right? Let there be Michael. And there was Michael. And Michael's like, whoa. And he's like, whoa, who are you? Or like, wow, you're the creator. And he just starts worshiping, right? And he says, Yehi Gabriel, right? Let there be Gabriel. And there he is. And he's like, oh wow, this is amazing. Right? It's just this instantaneous reality of who they're standing before floods their mind. And like, wow, like all of a sudden they realize I was just created and I'm standing before God, you know, I'm standing before God. There's this incredible sense of the magnitude of the being they're standing in front of.
It makes you really understand why they stand around and say, "Holy, holy, holy." It's like, how can you
Yeah,
say anything else? Yeah,
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's kind of like, when you see that most beautiful sunset and you're just like, oh, I'm out
mm,
of words, right? Or whatever that most beautiful thing you've ever seen just takes your breath away. There's
mm.
that sense of, I could do this all day, you know? I could keep saying holy, 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 and I'd be perfectly happy. I don't think God pre-programmed the cherubim so they have to keep saying holy, holy, holy.
Right.
How much longer do I have to say this, But they're like, I'm going to say it again every time I say it. There's
Yeah.
just a little bit more passion because I'm even more blown away after 5,000 years. I'm like, wow, you're awesome, you know. And then they say it again. They're like, oh, you're so amazing. It just keeps getting better.
Well,
That's what.
especially as they witness his plan being carried out here with us mere mortals, right?
Yeah,
It's like, wow, it's just amazing how he orchestrates all of these things to his glory.
I'm into that. Well, so he says, let there be light. That's day one. God divides the light from the darkness. Now, this, I think, again, we could spend lots of time on each of these, but God divided the light from the darkness. Where did the darkness come from? This is one of these beautiful, beautiful questions. In Isaiah 45:7, he says, I form the light and create darkness. What does it mean that God creates darkness? I mean, when we think about darkness, isn't darkness simply the absence of light? I mean, that's what we think when we think about darkness. It's just there's no light. But where did it come from? God says that He is the one who created the light. Excuse me, created the darkness, right? So, what does that mean? Before God created anything, there was only light. There was no such thing as darkness. And then God created a scenario, a possibility where there would not be light. And again, I think that is mind numbing that there was only ever light, and then God made it so that there wasn't light, right? That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever considered it in that sense, um, where, and it makes sense that he is pure light, right? And he had to create a scenario where there was darkness to
Hmm.
to ultimately fulfill creation, the creation of the earth and its environment.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
And
is this darkness tangible? Is this a tangible darkness?
well, in my mind, no. It's simply an absence. That's
An
all I would
absence.
consider. It's an absence. I don't think that there's an entity or a force called darkness. I don't think this is the creation of something bad necessarily. Although
Hmm.
in that same verse, he
Right?
says, "I form the light, create the darkness. I make peace and create calamity." In the King James, it says create evil, which I think is the correct translation there. I, the Lord, do all these things. In what sense did God create evil? And that sounds really weird. God didn't create evil. Yes, he did. But what is evil? That's what we understand. What is the definition of evil? God defines it. They did evil in my sight. They did that in which I do not delight. Isaiah 65, verse 12, and 66, verse 4. So both of those are saying the same thing, that they did evil in my sight. They chose that in which I do not delight. So evil is a choice. It's choosing the things that God doesn't like. But he lets us make the choice. And that's what is so important, because that's where free will comes into this, that God is giving us the opportunity to choose contrary to him. That's pretty significant when we think about it. And, if you were designing a video game and you wanted your characters to have the ability to die, then you have to create it in the code. You have to program that in the code that they have the potential to die. Doesn't mean that you're making your characters die, but you're giving them the potential to jump off the cliff if they want to. And that's essentially what God is doing. He has created the potential for us to jump off the cliff of righteousness and jump into evil if we so desire. He doesn't advise it, he doesn't want us to do that, but he's giving us the option. And only when we really have that option can we then truly, realistically go back to him and say, no, I don't want that choice. I want you. I want you. And so I think we should not overlook that God has given us the opportunity to choose contrary to him. And he does not force us to come to him, but he desires that we'd come to him. And that's where we have to choose. That's where I have to choose to love him. That's where you have to choose to love him. God is not going to make you do what is right. He calls you to do what is right, but he doesn't make you do what is right. All right, well, let's get back into our text. So just for the sake of time, maybe we should kind of skip over just a couple of these, because I could go on for a long time about the firmament. Oh, man. Yeah. So anyway, God creates this firmament. The firmament really here, the rakia, it's an expanse. It's not a hard metal dome as has been proposed, but it's an expanse. That's the word means. It's to expand. And so the rakia is the expansion thing. It's the expanse, or the expansion is really what that word is all about. And the expansion, of course, is where space happens. That's what we're talking about. So then he talks about waters under the heavens, and the waters, he gathered them together, and he called the dry land earth, and he gathered together the waters on the earth, and he called them seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. Beautiful stuff. Well, God has created the seeds on day 3, and then he's going to create the sun on day 4. So, of course, this always brings up the question, how old is the earth? Well, there really is a biblical sense that we have a young earth. And again, we don't have time to go into all of it, but there are different ways that we can understand how the cosmologists, et cetera, can look out into the deep recesses of the universe, and they can say, well, that stuff way over there on that side of the universe is 15 billion light years away, which means that it took 15 billion light years for that light of that star to get here. But there's something called cosmic expansion. Cosmic expansion, this is based on the theory of the Big Bang, which I think is true, at least in part. And it's this idea that you have this little universe, right? This tiny little thing, smaller than my fist, smaller than a dot on a piece of paper, and then it expanded. That's the idea of the Big Bang, right? So what's exciting about that theory is that the general consensus is that the expansion rate of that explosion, whatever you want to call it, right? The expansion is expanding faster than the speed of light. So the implications for that are huge. If the universe is expanding faster than the speed of light, that means it doesn't take 15 billion years for the light from a star that is 15 billion light years away. It doesn't take 15 billion years for that light to get to us, right? So think about it. Everything together was all clustered together, including the Earth, and then it starts to expand, and the Earth, let's just imagine, is in the middle for now. And so then everything relative to that is going to be expanding away from it, which is actually what we see. And we look in every direction, and everything is moving away from us, which suggests that we're in the middle. Okay, so this means that the expansion is happening faster. So the stuff that's way out here relative to the Earth, even though we measure it, it's 15 billion light years away, but it expanded. The expansion started here, right? And so the light was already there, and then it was stretched. And that's why we see the redshift. That's what Hubble noted, 100 and some years ago. He noted that redshift, and that's how the whole idea of the Big Bang came about. So that's just one of the proofs that we have that, you can actually have a young Earth in what looks to be a old universe. Now, I know there's other things that we have to deal with, such as biological evolution. That's a whole another discussion. But, if we can find one answer in one area, we might find another answer in another area. So I'm encouraged that we might actually be able to figure out how to put the old and the young together at the same time. Be kind of cool. All right.
Well, shall we move on? Yes.
Yes, let's do it. All right. So then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens, and to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Then God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. What really strikes me, Gary, is that God did not create, let there be cows, right? Let there be lions. Let there be sea lions. Let there be walruses, right? He doesn't say that, let there be sharks, whales. He says, let the seas bring forth. Let the sea bring forth, or seas bring forth the living creature, right? So it's just a small detail, and yet there's something about it, so we clearly see that God is the creator of these things, and yet he's commanding the water to bring forth the living creature. Again, very interesting. There's a lot of things of evolution that I totally object to, okay? But when we're sort of looking at the big scheme of things, your average evolutionist will believe that life started in the waters. And guess what? They're right. Okay, they're right about that. Now, I don't think that everything started to, come up out of the water and make it on the dry land. Because then God says, let the land, let the earth bring forth the living creature. And it was so. So again, we see that out of the dirt, stuff just came up, right? So you get the sense that, there's this kind of this pile of dirt, and then out pops the tiger. You're like, whoa, that's kind of cool, right? And whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, you still have the chicken and the egg problem. Which one came first? Tell me it's the egg. Okay, who laid the egg? Okay, it's the chicken. All right, how did it get there? You still have that same problem. no matter how far you go back, you come back to the chicken and the egg problem. And the Bible is like the chicken. It's definitely the chicken. Okay. The Bible makes no pretense about it. The chicken came first, right? But they came fully formed, the chickens and the tigers and the lions and the horses. And should I say that their kind, the horse kind? So what is the horse kind? Well, that's going to include obviously the, stallions that we think about. That's going to include ponies. That's going to include donkeys. However, it might have been sort of that one horse kind, right? Instead of having these various species, we have just one proto horse, and we have one proto lion or something, and one proto dog or one proto wolf. And then as the years went on, we then have the speciation of these different creatures. And when it comes to dogs, we have an incredible array of dogs, but most of the diversification of the dog is because of humans, not because of evolution. It was because of human breeding of dogs that we have, these 500 and some species of dogs. So again, there's so many things when we start looking at the details. You're like, okay, I get it. So obviously the big thing is that God created it. He did not use evolution in the typical sense that it was built on year after year of death, but within the species, within the kind, you then have a micro evolution where changes do begin to occur. The cat kind are still cats, right? They never turn into porcupines, but you're going to have different variations on that cat theme as time goes on. Just as there's a variation on the human theme, right? Everyone is all different sizes and shapes and colors, and that's because of the variation processes that God put into our DNA.
It seems to me that regardless of which side you're on in terms of a creationist or an evolutionist, that it's very common for people to limit God's power, to be able to create as he does and allow creation to flourish as it did. And so we have a tendency, I think, to say, well, it's got to be the way that I think or it couldn't have happened. And I think it's real easy to fall into that trap.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Gary Allen says, that's very interesting. The nerd in me is very interested, but sometimes we just make things so complicated. Not everything is going to fit in a scientific explanation. Sometimes we just have to trust. Gary, I totally agree with that. Gary Allen, that's absolutely true. Sometimes it's good to trust. And yet God has put that curiosity within us. And I think sometimes when we can at least say, I'm going to try to take away my bias, whether it's a religious bias or a scientific bias or an evolutionary bias, or sort of the, let's worship man kind of bias. To say, okay, let's just talk about the facts, right? And, we don't have to understand all of these higher things to have a relationship with God. That's what's so beautiful about it. And yet, God did make an incredible universe. He did put this curiosity within our hearts to try to understand, that it's his glory to hide things, and it's our joy to discover things, And I love discovering new things about God's creation. And that drives me forward. He could have just said, here's everything you need to know, but he didn't. He wants us to go and discover it. And so all I'm suggesting is when we compare the Bible to some of the mainstream science, we actually find a lot of parallels. And sometimes it just takes a moment to just say, okay, what are we really talking about? What's really in the text, and what are the the scientists, so-called, what are they actually saying? And then we start to find that there's some pretty cool areas of overlap. It's really exciting that way.
Yeah. And then when you discover those new things, it's like, of course, and it just reinforces
Yeah.
their beliefs over and over again.
Yep. So true. All right. Then God said, let us make man in our image. According to our likeness, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God made man in his own image. In the image of man, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. Uh, to it you shall be, to you it shall be for food. Sorry. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life. I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So then God creates really his masterpiece. He saves the best for last, right? And yeah, I am human, so I'm a little bit partial to humanity. But I also see from this text that God is telling us that this is a big deal, right? He made all this amazing stuff, and then he made a creature in his own likeness, in his own image. We're now coming to that as a race. We're now starting to make robots in our own image and in our own likeness. Man has been created for thousands of years. We've created all kinds of cool stuff. We've created, cars and factories and buildings, and they're all glorious. But now we're creating a robot, right? We're creating robots that really are beginning to look like us. They're beginning to act like us, which is a little bit scary. Um, and that will be our crowning achievement. It might be our destruction, quite frankly. But assuming everything goes well, which it's not going to, but assuming that it did, it's pretty impressive, right? That we're now to the point where we can create things in our image and our likeness. And that's what God did. So how, if we were creating, if I got to be at the wheel, how would I create a robot in my image and in my likeness? Would I give it the ability to say no? Or would I only say, let it say yes? Right? What if I wanted to have a friendship with this robot? What? But I only let it say yes. Do you love me? Yes. Am I the greatest? Yes. Right? I'm like, you know what? I like the response, but I don't believe it because it can't say no. So, how do I really know that this thing loves me? Because I kind of programmed it to say yes. So then I have to program it with the ability to say no. And then if it always says yes, then I'm like, hey, great, because I know you can say no. And so therefore, when you say yes, I know that you mean it. Right? And that is what God did with us. He gave us the ability to say, I don't want you. I'm not going to follow you. I don't like you. He doesn't want that. But we have the option. And of course, that's what we're going to see in chapter 2, chapter 3, especially, of course, is that whole story.
Yeah.
Which, I'm looking at the clock. We're almost out of time. So we'll have to skip that for today. But I just think it's so important.
But that's really risky for God to do that because you go through all this work of creation, of creating this earth and making it perfect, and then giving the choice. But without that, there's no true love. There's no true relationship. It's basically we're servants. We're yes men. We just do as we do as we're programmed to do. And what fun is that? Or how fulfilling is that? Or what love is that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so well said. So in chapter 2, of course, we have a reiteration of the creation event, but with a very important difference that it's focusing on day 6. It's focusing on the creation of man. So what we often see in Scripture is we see kind of a big overview, and then we go back for more detail. We got that all throughout the book of Revelation, where we get this kind of this big picture, and then we start zooming in. I call it the thematic approach, and I think the thematic approach is something we see throughout Scripture. So rather than getting confused, well, which one is the real authentic creation? Is it chapter 1 or chapter 2? Both, but they're dealing with different aspects of creation. One is, here's everything that God created, and day 2, by and large, is the creation of man. That's really what it's about, and then what the purpose that God gave to man, which is to tend the garden. And then, of course, in chapter 3, we have this nachash, this snake that comes around. Now, so you guys know, I'm writing a book on Satan and lots of other stuff. So I hope you get a chance to read that. I'm terribly excited to share it with everybody. I'm proofing it right now. But there's a whole backstory to Satan. We don't have time for it, but there's a huge backstory. God created him perfectly good. He was a high priest. He was God's prime minister, his viceroy, right? His chancellor, whatever you want to call it. Right? He was God's number one dude. And God gave him the keys of the kingdom to do as he would. And then he betrayed the trust, because God gives every one of us an opportunity to be a servant to somebody else, to serve someone lesser than ourselves. And guess what? If you are the greatest of God's creation, who are you supposed to serve? Everybody, right? And how do I know this is true? Because when Jesus came, what did he say? I didn't come to be served, but to serve.
Yep.
And to give my life as a ransom for many. So if God came and he says, this is what my kingdom is about, to be a servant, then that's what Satan was required to do. And guess what? He's like, nothing. And so he went the other direction, and he rebelled against that. That's what chapter 3 is all about in a nutshell, since we're kind of out of time here. But it was, unfortunate. It was selfish, of course. That's what his kingdom is all about. And sadly, Adam and Eve bought the lie. For their own reasons, they bought the lie. And then God says, okay. In fact, I'm going to skip to chapter 3, verse 15 with your approval, Gary.
Sure.
And so this right here, that's not 15. I can do this. Okay, 3:15. Right, so God then comes along and says, what's going on here? And Adam says, it's the woman you gave me, right? So thanks a lot, Adam. And then he says to the woman, what's going on here? He says, it was the serpent. He deceived me and I ate. And so then God says in verse 3:15, I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. This is what we call the proto-evangelion. The proto-evangelion is the first good news. Okay, so imagine that you were Adam and Eve and you were kind of stupid and you ate this fruit. God said not to eat it, and guess what? You just gave away the whole farm, right? You just gave away all that dominion that we read about in chapter 1. God's like, I'm giving everything to you guys, right? I just created the whole world, and guess what? You're now the heir, right? It's in your name. I'm signing this off to your name. And then Satan comes along and says, hey, can I have that check, please? And Adam's like, this one, do you want it? And he's like, yeah, that's the one. So Adam's like, here you go, right? And he gives it to Satan and signs off, and I'm signing this over to Satan, right? That's essentially what he did. And so then God comes along and says, what's going on here? Satan's like, oh, nothing. Nothing. They just gave the whole dominion to me. And so people say, why didn't God just have Jesus show up right then and there in the garden and, die for the sins of mankind? Because Satan's not an idiot, guys. He's not stupid, right? He acts on authority. He's very, very sly. In fact, I think he's so sly that he navigates his way through the loopholes, right? he does things that are quote unquote legal, but not ethical, right? What did he really do in the beginning that was so terrible? He just said, "Did God really say?" You know, and yeah, he did tell a little lie, "You won't die," but he didn't make Adam and Eve do what they did. They did that to themselves, and so he's very, very sly that way. And so he's not going to just say, "Oh, you're coming to die for the sins of humanity. Okay, go for it, but I'm not giving you this piece of paper back." And we see that piece of paper being on full display in Revelation chapter 5, where John sees this scroll that is at the right hand of the Father, and he's weeping because nobody in heaven or on earth was worthy to open the scroll and open its seal. Right? He's weeping. And then the elder says, "Don't cry. The lion of the tribe of Judah has overcome." And then he looks around, and what does he see? A lamb that's been slain. Right? So Jesus had to come, and he had to die for humanity, yes, but he had to do it in such a way that Satan thought he was winning. Okay. And that is how he was able to get those keys back and said, so when he went down and he spoke to the spirits in prison that were disobedient, formerly in the days of Noah, when he went down there and he proclaimed, it's like he's taking the keys. He's like, "Hey guys, look what I got. I got the keys." Right. And they're like, "Oh man, bummer." So he got it back. This is why Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are so important, because we have to understand, how did we get in this predicament? How did we get into this world of sin? And why has God let it go on for so long? Because God is righteous. He can't just snap his fingers and everything is different. That would be unjust, right? And God is just. So he has to play within his own rules, and he always will. And Satan knows that, and that's God's one weakness, if you want to call it a weakness. But that's the one place where Satan can try to, get God over a barrel, is to say, "Well, you have to be just. You have to do what you said you were going to do. You cannot lie. If you do, you're just like me, right? And you might as well join my kingdom." And so he cannot do that. Satan offered the kingdom to Jesus, and Jesus said, "No, thanks. I'm going to do it the right way." And it did cost him dearly. "Father, is there any other way?" And when he asked that, what did he hear? Crickets, right? He heard nothing. The father's like, "Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot, Jesus. I forgot. There's this other way, and I forgot to tell you about it. But now that you're mentioning it, and you're in the garden there, and you're kind of stressed, there's another way." No, there was no other way, and it's a pretty cool story. So. Yes. Yeah, that's a pretty cool story. So we got 2 minutes, Gary. I'm going to summarize really quick. So chapter 4, about Cain and Abel. Yeah, it didn't go so well. Cain got kind of mad at his brother and killed him. And so what we see is this progression. Things go from being perfect. Then we have the sin of Adam and Eve, right? So then the world is now in sin. And then we have the first murder, right? That's what chapter 4 is about, the first murder. And then at the end of that chapter, it says that the sons of Seth, in their days, is when profaning the name of the Lord happened, right? And there's a whole story about that. Chapter 5 primarily is a genealogy. And then we go into chapter 6, where you have the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair or good, tovot, and they took any that they chose. And it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they begot children who were the mighty men of renown, the men of old, the men of renown, right? So there you have this whole other thing that happens, right? And then God calls Noah to build an ark. So it goes from awesome to really bad. So yeah.
And just the first section of scripture that we read at the beginning of the year, that's really leaves your head spinning to see how quickly
Yeah.
the fall from grace happens, and how quickly we fall, how quickly we can be deceived, and how quickly we can, slip from what God puts us in this. He creates this perfect plan of redemption for us, and we just in a split second just turn away from Him. And it's all encapsulated right here in these first 6 chapters, in the very first parasha of the new Torah cycle. It's amazing.
The good news is that after the 7,000 years are completed, we will not fall into this cycle again, which I'm really excited about.
Because it comes to a stop, and at Zeret,
Yep.
and we enter into the 8th.
Yep. That's beautiful. So, man, that's just gorgeous. Well, hey guys, if you're in the Denver area, come hang out with us every Shabbat. We're in Lakewood. Go to thewaycongregation.com for more information about that. We are going to Israel next year. Go to the website about that. We hope you'll come with us. It's really going to be a great time. And thank you guys for tuning in, for your support, for being part of this. And we just want to say God bless and good night.